We are going to be talking, of course, about our theme of the month, which this month is settlements and their needs. So that's going to be villages and colonies and cities and how everything all fits together. And we're focusing particularly today on how settlements thrive and grow, why they get started in the first place, and in some states, why they fall. So these are all great questions for us world builders. Of course, if you have any questions from our incredibly eminent guest, who I will introduce in a minute, or myself, you can ask questions by saying capital letters question, and then your question. And that's going to mean that our magical producing fairies will get those questions to us, and we will be answering our questions at the end of the stream. So in about 15 minutes or so, we will also have short breaks. That's going to be another great opportunity to ask questions. But I think it is time to introduce my amazing guest, Hamish Forbes. How are you doing, Hamish?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. We had some quite some technical gremlins. We always talk about this. I always tell our guests we start our call 30 minutes before we go live, just in case there are any technical gremlins. There never are, but just in case today it was only gremlins. It was gremlins from start to finish. So let me introduce Hamish quickly, because he's far too modest to introduce himself. Dr. Hamish Forbes has his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, USA, and of course his BA and MA in archaeology and anthropology from Cambridge University, UK. He's conducted archaeological fieldwork in the UK, Ireland, USA, Italy, Greece, the moon, and everywhere else. He's conducted graphic fieldwork in Greece in 2 different parts of the Peloponnese, Crete, the island of Skiros, and currently in central Greece. His main research is in the Mediterranean rural landscapes and the history of those, and how to link recent and modern evidence to the and prehistoric past. Amazing. All right, I can see some books here as well. A Rough and Rocky Place, the landscape of settlement history in a Methana Peninsula. Wow. Okay, so we're looking a lot at landscapes and sort of how people interact with the settlement and that kind of thing. Is that quite the focus of your research?
Yes, it's looking at how settlements appeared and disappeared and reappeared in different places from prehistory up until the present day.
That is fantastic. And that, of course, is exactly what we're going to be talking about today, is the seeding of settlements, and then where do we go from there? So I suggest that we kick straight off with one of these questions. How do settlements get started? Like, what makes people want to hang around in a single place for a whole bunch of time?
Well, there are a wide range of different reasons why people might want to go to a particular place. Some places just beg to be settled in, if you like, and the technical archaeological term for this is affordance, which is simply a way of saying that some places just look like good places to settle. For instance, in many periods, there is quite a lot of warfare going on, and so you want a defendable place. So a hilltop looks like a good bet. And these may be reoccupied time and time again. So for instance, in Britain, you find in what archaeologists call the Neolithic period, this is a period of the first farmers, that certain places high places get fortified, and then they get abandoned, and we actually have evidence in some places of lots of stone arrowheads embedded in the fortifications, and sometimes evidence of burning, and then the area is abandoned, and then in the Iron Age, several thousand years later, it gets reoccupied. And then some of these sites, there's a very famous site called Maiden Castle in southern England, which has one of these Neolithic settlements, and then it has an Iron Age settlement, and that Iron Age settlement also has evidence of destruction by the Romans.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, the Romans moved everybody out of their defensible position and moved them down to lower ground where the Romans could keep better control over them. So places like defensible hilltops see often several different periods of occupation because they just ask to be settled. So that's one possibility.
That's really fascinating.
So another line that often happens is communication. So where you've got, say, a road network, where it crosses a river, you may get connections between river travel and road travel.
Okay.
And so people come together at that point for various reasons. And that means that where people constantly come together, they might say, well, this looks like a good place. Actually, instead of just meeting up and saying, how do you do? And here's what I've got to trade. What have you got to trade instead? They say, let's sit here. Let's build a house here. And then people can come to us and trade, and we don't have to go to them.
Right. So super practical.
Super practical. What we're talking about, if you want to lump everything together, you say resources. You say resources of feeling safe. You say resources of things to trade, or a place where people come to trade, or a resource might even be religious. There are times when an important religious site, somebody may have a vision or something like that, or an isolated religious site might attract people so often that somebody decides that they'll build a permanent building there, and people start to settle around it, and the whole place starts to grow. So there are a lot of different possible reasons why people might choose a particular site, but it also has to have resources like water. You can't have an easily defensible site if there's miles and miles and miles, kilometers worth of desert all the way around and nothing to drink.
Right.
So a water source is important. So that's another reason why people might want a settlement close to a river.
Of course. What about things like arable land or resources like lumber or resources like stone? Do they have an impact on where settlements might be founded?
Yes, and there's a slightly curious example that you get from Roman Britain, for instance, where abandoned Roman sites become attractive to later settlement because they can then mine the buildings that the Romans left behind.
Right, they scavenge the pre-cut bricks, right? The pre-cut stone.
And the bricks. Yes, so that is interesting because you can't really disentangle the possible idea that it's just a very handy place to settle anyway from the added bonus that it's got all these building materials ready to go where you don't have to cut the stone or bake the bricks.
Sure.
But arable land, yes, you've got to have something to eat, which you get either by trade or more securely if you grow it yourself. So you will have, you need to have some kind of food product, whatever that might be, lots of fish. You might be a settlement close to the sea. Again, if you're talking about fishing, you would need a safe harbor or at least a fairly sheltered beach that you can draw boats up onto. And if there's piracy, you may want to have your village up on a rocky knoll somewhere so that you can defend yourself. So things like that come into play. But I'm currently researching in Greece. I don't know how many of your the people listening to this will have heard of the Greek poet Hesiod, but he lived in central Greece, somewhere roughly around 600 BCE, and at that time, the city where he lived was called Ascri. Right. And archaeologists have discovered this city. It's beside an area with a lot of cultivation in the present day. And that went on for quite a long time. But then in the unstable times of the Middle Ages, the settlement moved to a hill above the ancient Greek town, and then stayed there, but they still cultivated the land, but they just had to walk farther to get to the land. Okay. And then the village moved down from this rocky pinnacle because they had to walk quite a distance to get the water. So they moved down again, but to a different site yet again, where there was a spring, so they could get water easily, and where they could also dig wells. But they still cultivated the same land. So settlements can actually move about the landscape depending on other factors that are influencing settlement, but still exploit the same agricultural land.
That's absolutely fascinating. And that's something that I think to most of our audience that would never have considered, that would never have occurred to them, that you can be working with the same land from sort of multiple different settlements at different times. That's fascinating. So I'm going to ask you to generalize here, which is very cruel for a specialist. Can you tell me some of the common aspects of early settlements, some of the things that you see most often? So that might be the kind of structures that you see, or the kind of practices that you see, or sort of anything like that.
Well, one of the things that anthropologists are fascinated by is the fact that when you get lots of people together, you get arguments, you get disputes, you get neighbors getting into hassles with other neighbors, and therefore you have to have some kind of organization to solve these disputes, because otherwise they get out of control until somebody hits somebody else over the head and they fall down dead, and then the relatives get in and they try to kill the person who's just killed their relative. So as you start getting settlements building up, so you also have to have some kind of dispute settlement organization, judges or whatever it might be, as a way of stopping disputes getting out of control.
Yeah.
Now, among hunter-gatherers, for instance, and I'm going to be very academic here, but among hunter-gatherers who are constantly on the move, if they get into a bad dispute, one of the parties in the dispute says, the heck with this, I'm not putting up with this any longer, and they walk off, and that's the end of the dispute. But once you have a resource which can't be moved, or you can't move yourself easily to another resource. So if you're stuck by a waterhole, or if you own agricultural land that you depend on, then you can't simply say, the heck with it, I'm going somewhere else. So you are stuck, the neighbors are stuck, and if there is an argument, then somebody has got to try and sort it out. So as settlements get bigger, you get dispute settlement organizations. And this, in places like the Near East, for instance, you find cities developing at a really early stage. So the ancient city of Jericho, for instance, where Joshua fit the battle, goes back to about 9000 BCE, when hunters and gatherers were beginning to settle down around a very important spring and start to exploit wild cereals, which were growing in the area. And therefore, when you've got a lot of wild cereals, it's heavy and you can't cart it about. So you are stuck close to your food. And that's when the city starts to develop. And we assume that from this sort of early stage, they would have started to develop dispute settlement organizations. By the Bronze Age, you have major cities in the Middle East with kings and judges who were there as much as anything to solve disputes. And some of the earliest writing that we have is what are known as law codes.
Sure.
And there, what you can and can't do is written down so that people can say, this is now set and available for everybody to see.
Literally set in stone.
Yes, literally set in stone. So this is one of the things that tends to happen when you start getting lots of people coming together.
Yeah, which is, for me, that's fascinating, because as world builders, we focus largely on physical buildings and structures and infrastructures, and we talk about aqueducts, and we talk about, you know, why structures form in certain places. But we forget that when people get together, they all want to kill each other. And that is one of the main problems for settlements, is people being frickin' people, and how to deal with that.
And this is where kings come in, particularly in the early stages of what anthropologists call state formation, when you start getting not just petty chiefs, but actual states with a king who has some real power. The really big questions get taken to the king. And the king's biggest house, and anthropologists have studied a lot of this in Africa, the king's biggest house, bigger than anywhere else, becomes a courtroom.
Wow, yeah.
And then people come along, and each side presents its case. And in the less well-developed areas, what the dispute settler, the king or the chief or whoever it is, does is actually to see how best, not to apply law, but how to sort out this dispute so it stops being a dispute.
Right.
So that everybody's feathers stop being ruffled.
Sure, absolutely. And this is where Solomon chopping babies in half all comes from.
Yes, exactly. He was a king, and the insoluble questions got taken to the king, and that one was insoluble. Now, in Egypt, the pharaoh had a vizier. And the vizier was sort of second in command to the pharaoh. So the pharaoh didn't adjudicate the really difficult disputes. And the vizier wore white clothes to show that he was he couldn't be influenced. He was absolutely fair. And so he was the proxy to the pharaoh to solve the disputes. And actually, in the UK, until very recently, the highest court of the land was the House of Lords. And the Lords in the Middle Ages, of course, were often the relatives of the king anyway, one way or another, either by marriage or by blood. And therefore, the Lords themselves acted as the proxy for the king.
Yeah.
Again, so you've got, with the development of settlements, anthropologists say you often find the development of elites. Elite people, part of whose job is to make sure that they try and sort out disputes.
Sure.
So with the growth of settlement, you also get the growth of social disparity, if you like. You've got haves and you've got have-nots.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that is the most common thing, is how to stop people torturing each other. Fascinating. What is the most uncommon thing or things you've seen in historical settlements? So I'm talking weird stuff, edge cases, stuff that like can't be explained. I know in archaeology a lot of times you look at something and the last thing that you want to say is we think it's religious, or we think it's it's something to do, it's spiritual, but
it's irrational, therefore it's irrational, therefore it's got to be religious.
Exactly.
But anthropologists will say is it may be irrational to us, but it may not have been irrational to other people. But I'll give you an example, and it actually comes from the research I did over many years in Greece, in the Peloponnese. And that involves a small peninsula called Methana. And at various points, it had settlements in different parts of this small peninsula. In the Middle Ages, there was one up, but then in the Greek War of Independence, which started in 1821, there was a great deal of armies coming and going, and a substantial number of refugees fetched up on this river, and they chose settlement which were far enough from the coast that they could see pirates coming and run away. Not defend themselves, but run away into the high places in the interior. A range of different possible positions they could have chosen, and almost every single case, the position they chose had a church. And so looking for was, if you like, a spiritual resource when I talked about, in general, resources. So I spent 2 years living in one of these villages, and this particular village, the first thing they did when they made the new settlement was research. So after that, they started building houses. So it was very definitely that they wanted this spiritual support when they. So again, we don't think that as rational, but to them it was thoroughly rational.
Right, absolutely.
This population, which had largely abandoned the peninsula, so they found these churches and said, right, we have God with us, let's start and build our settlement here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one example.
Oh, you're just cutting out there a bit, Hamish. Sorry about that. I think your internet's gone a little bit beeful.
Yes, it's rural broadband.
Fresh from the field, still in some bits.
It works at the speed of a cow.
That was very amusing. Thank you.
That's utterly awful.
Oh no! I met my match, people.
Oh, we can milk this one a lot longer.
Oh dear. Yeah, this has gone terribly wrong. Okay. So we are going to actually cut for a very short break now because it is already that time. Hamish, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for this.
You're very welcome. I enjoy talking about my subject.
Fantastic. We have had a wonderful time listening, and we will be back in about 3 or 4 minutes. So guys, it's a great time for you to go grab a drink. It's a great time for you to ask us some questions. So remember, you can do that by writing in the chat in capital letters question and then your question, and that gives our producers visibility so they can get that to me here, and I will be asking Hamish our questions in about 20 minutes time. So guys, we will see you very, very shortly. And we are back. At least I think we are. Otherwise, you just saw me making some very funny faces with my fingers as I was doing the counting. We have been nattering away and making some silly puns. But we are back to talk about growth and development of settlements. In the first half, we talked about why settlements are put where they're put. And now we're going to talk about how they develop. So, Hamish, talk to me. What causes settlements to grow and change? And why do cities form?
Well, underlying it all is they have to have more people. Cities grow, or settlements grow, because there are more people in them. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. If you've got very unstable conditions where there's then people simply don't have as many children, and not as many children grow up, or people get killed before they can have as many children as they want. In general, that periods of instability with a lot of warfare and so forth result in a drop in population. Where you peace, then on the whole, populations tend to increase, as long as there's enough food for them to eat. Or when trade increases, for instance, and with some of this, we're talking about technology. As technology changes, you may get bigger ships, for instance, or new methods of transportation like the railways or the canals. The biggest cities around the world normally have occurred since the Industrial Revolution, because transport not only brings more goods about, it can also bring food in to settlements more easily from further away. The bigger the ships, the faster they are, the more food they can bring in. Or the railways can bring in food in the way that the horse and cart simply cannot. So there is an issue here with technology. The Romans, of course, were terrific town builders, city builders, and one of the ways they did this was because they controlled the peace. In Latin, it's known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it's during this period of peace that the cities increase in size. And the Romans built much bigger ships than they had previously. And so, for instance, the city of Rome grew as much as anything because they could ship large amounts of wheat in from Egypt. And they got large amounts of olive oil from Spain and North Africa. And they brought so much olive oil in amphorae, these large pottery containers, when they brought it into the Roman port, which was called Ostia, a lot of these containers were chucked away. And there is, in fact, a massive hill which is composed entirely of broken amphorae, which just gives you some idea of the amount of mouths that were soaking up the olive oil brought into Rome because of the peace and because of the transport networks. And of course, the Romans also built roads. They were famous for building roads. And what we often find is that the roads cross rivers at about the point where rivers stop being tidal. So you can bring supplies, food and all sorts of trade goods up the rivers on the incoming tide, but once you get to the place where it no longer reaches any further, you've got to offload your goods, and this is often the place where you find a Roman road crossing. And of course, this is a super place to have a settlement anyway, and as the Romans continued for several centuries, so many of these places grew inside. But as soon as the Roman Empire starts to fall apart, then cities start to shrink again. So it is very much dependent for many periods on the amount of peace they have. But of course, you've also got things like transport. A good example is Chicago. which was the railhead for all the cattle coming in from the Midwest. So Chicago expanded substantially with the result of all these cattle coming in from the railroad.
That's really interesting. Huh. Cool. So yeah, what we're seeing then is that basically use equals growth in a way.
Yes. Yes.
And the other, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this can also cause shrinkage of some settlements if a new communication network results in moving away from where settlements are. So, for instance, where I've been doing research in southern Italy, the road and the rail networks, the railroad was put in the middle of the 19th century or a bit later. At that point, most of the settlements were up quite high up in the mountains for security reasons, and everything had to be transported on pack animals, or normally pack animals, in fact. But as soon as the railway comes in, then settlements start forming around the railway, and there is a hemorrhaging of population from the mountain settlements down to the coast. So in the present day, most of the population in this area of southern Italy is close to the coast. But in the Middle Ages, most of the population was up in the mountains.
Huh.
So communication networks can also drain populations at the same time as they are encouraging new settlements in other places.
That's so interesting. So we've talked about technology. How about aspects like culture and religion? How can they affect how settlements form and grow and develop? Sorry.
Well, there is a question that anthropologists can't really answer, and that is, why do Mediterranean cultures over thousands of years have tightly based settlements? So you get settlements in the Mediterranean where everybody lives very, very close together.
Sure.
But in Northern Europe, going back into prehistory and even in historical periods, you tend not to have these very tightly defined cities. The Celts in particular seem to have been the world's worst town planners. In Ireland, you don't get cities until the Vikings come in and found Dublin. And so Dublin is actually a Viking settlement founded on a very good anchorage. Again, transportation networks, if you like. But the Celts, on the whole, had a cultural tradition, certainly in Western Europe, of having very scattered settlement.
Interesting.
And where you've got new settlement in landscapes which have previously not been heavily settled, like for instance in Iceland, you tend to have isolated farms rather than a whole series of densely, what anthropologists would call, nucleated settlements. If you like, the Mediterranean has the nuclear option, but only in settlement terms. Somewhere like Iceland, for instance, has the non-nuclear option, where all the farms are separated. And you get the same thing in the Midwest of the US, where farms are, on the whole, are separated out. They are scattered across the landscape rather than people living in villages and going out to their land.
Yeah, fascinating. And so that has a massive impact on how people are using the land, and then, you know, how settlements are forming themselves.
And how they get together. How do you find out things if you are on an isolated farm? You've got to make sure you can go and talk to other people. Who's selling a bit of land? What's happened to so-and-so? If you're living in a nucleated settlement, it's easy enough to find out because all your neighbors are talking about it. And so this is a sort of cultural thing that anthropologists notice. They can describe it, but it's very hard to explain exactly why it should be. It's possibly something to do with the environment. But anthropologists don't like environmental explanations as forcing people to do things. They might say it somewhat constrains people's choices, but it usually doesn't force people to do things. People have the option of a variety of different ways of coping with any particular issue that they have to deal with.
Awesome. I have one final question for you before we jump to our audience questions, and that is, I'm going to preface this for our audience with a little bit of blurb, so forgive me. Of course, when we talk about dungeons and dungeon crawling in Dungeons and Dragons, we're not talking about, something that was built as a ruin, right? We're talking about something that was built as probably a settlement or a city or a system, or it's a ruined temple, or it's a ruined, it's something that was a pre-existing structure that has been reused as a dungeon of some kind. So my question for you, Hamish, is what are some common reasons that settlements become abandoned or ruined? Why do people leave, right?
Well, one possibility is that they get destroyed in warfare.
Sure.
If people decide that they are going to put up a fight, a resistance to an invader, and the invading general decides that he got really pissed off with this city, he may take everybody out and just destroy it. So, for instance, the Romans completely destroyed Carthage, and it's always said that they sowed the fields with salt so that nothing would grow in the fields. It may be that there's no longer the settlement can no longer be useful. If the sea, for instance, recedes from a port, so you can't get boats there any longer, you may get a few houses left with people doing agriculture, but the main reason is that has gone. It may be that people, the plague is a good example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in Europe, in parts of Europe where something like a third of the population and occasionally a half of the population died in the Black Death, those few people left in several different villages may have decided to move to one of them so that there were enough people left for all the different functions they needed. So disease is a possibility. Warfare, just changing economies.
Absolutely. I guess with settlements that rely on a particular resource, if that resource dries up, then that would be another reason. Like if a mine dries up, for example. Yes,
or again from southern Italy, where people in the past, in the beginning of, say, in 1900, people were prepared to scratch a living on mountain hillsides, just in able to survive. But by 1960, when there was lots of work in major cities, in factories and so forth, they said, to heck with this, I'm not busting my tail end, scratching a living on these terrible fields. I'm going to make a decent living working in a factory. And so you've got a series of completely abandoned villages because nobody wanted to live that poor any longer when there were better options somewhere else.
Sure. So when options for quality of life change, you see settlements changing with them, obviously.
Yes, yes.
Very cool. All right. Well, that is it for my questions because we have some awesome questions from our audience. So, Hamish, if you are up for it, I have some extra questions for you. Fantastic.
Yes,
okay,
bring it on.
Okay, then. Our first question is from Azzy Steele, who asks, what makes a good trading post?
Communication. You are unable to trade if people can't get there. So a good harbour, a crossroads where lots of people come together. And there are actually villages in England with two words, and the first word is chipping. And chipping has got nothing to do with sliced potatoes in bags. It is a very old way of, an old word for a market. And these are usually at crossroads. And people keep coming together at markets at crossroads. And so you then get a settlement building around it. So this empty space becomes a central place. So, or it may be where, for instance, the Roman road crosses the river at the highest point for the tide. That's a very good place. And several different cities around the world, around Europe, where this happens, have markets. Or it may be a fortification where people feel safe coming underneath the walls of the castle, for instance, so that they can exchange goods.
Fantastic. Wow, that's loads of options there. Thank you. So I've got another question from a Hadnafaln. These names are always amazing. This one is, what is typically left behind as settlements are abandoned? Now, my first thought on that would be it depends why and how it was abandoned.
Yes. It depends partly on what the settlement is constructed of. Because if it's constructed of simple wooden buildings, very quickly those disappear. What you may find is the trash piles. And archaeologists regularly find themselves excavating the trash pile. Because the trash is what nobody wants, so nobody carries it away. The stuff that gets carried away is the stuff that's really valuable, unless it's very heavy and valuable, in which case it tends to get buried, and archaeologists may find it later on. So in many parts of the world where you've got mud houses, the mud may just simply disintegrate, and you've got very little left. If you've got stone buildings, then, or even stone foundations with mud walls on or wooden walls on top, then you may find the stone walls last for a long time.
Sure. Okay. Fantastic. So laws of biodegradable matter apply.
Yes. As I've already said, one of the problems, if you've got really good stone foundations, people come along and take them off and build a different house with them somewhere else.
Right, absolutely. Although I would say that this is negotiable in two circumstances: where things are in bogs, in anaerobic environments, or otherwise I will not trade for that reason, or if it's terribly, terribly dry. And then you end up with things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. You end up with things like the bog bodies, where things are preserved. And if you've had a moment like that, for some reason, you've had a phenomena like that, you will find things that you otherwise might not.
And Viking Dublin is a good example, because the earliest levels of Viking Dublin and many of the levels in Viking York in northern England also were waterlogged. So you've got a lot of preservation there. And the Roman fort of Vindolanda, up near the Scottish border, actually has trash piles which were waterlogged. And they've actually found written tablets and written letters in these trash piles, which were preserved by the anaerobic conditions.
Funnily enough, and I should tell you this because we know each other quite well, do you know where they find ancient recorders?
Oh, in cesspits.
Yes, in toilets. Because people are clearly playing the recorder on the toilet, it drops down, and then because it's completely waterlogged and disgusting, it survives.
May I say they were deterred from getting them back?
That was a crappy pun. Oh dear, we're not going to manage this today, are we? Okay. Okay, then. I have a question here, which is a slightly theoretical question. So if
Yes.
you don't have an immediate answer, don't feel bad. Rocker the Third says, oh, sorry, Rocker the Red, I beg your pardon. In my world, an entire civilization evacuated from a dying world to this one. How would you imagine the dynamics of such a massive influx of refugees into previously unoccupied world?
Probably fragmentation, in that people would spread out, and unless there was very good dispute settlement, you would, or a very strong leader, you would have all sorts of people trying to claim key resources. Again, it's disruption. And unless there is a very strong head, this will lead to a period of considerable disputes, if not open warfare. And quite likely, you will get a whole series of factions. As soon as you land, you get a whole series of factions, and people no longer able to stand each other, especially if they've been cooped up for a long journey in a very tight place. It's a bit like getting a whole lot of archaeologists together working for 8 weeks. By the end of it, they can't stand the sight of each other.
Right, now everyone needs a shower.
And everybody needs a shower, yes.
Okay, so in a similar vein, I have one more for you, and the answer may in fact be the same. This is a question from Marosia, and they ask, besides the completely different climate and environment, what challenges does an extraterrestrial settlement face in its early stages as compared with their terrestrial counterparts? So I know that you are not a space specialist. You are a man of the ancient world, but just if you can use your imagination.
Because people have moved to new locations on this planet as well as in other planets, you have potential of new diseases. You have the potential of transporting your diseases to a new world, and they could seriously damage whatever flora and fauna on that other world. You have the problem of probably, unless you've got a mass evacuation, you've got a very small population. And there are all sorts of biological studies of what happens when you've got very small starting populations. The mutineers on the Bounty, for instance, there were, I think, 9 women or something, and therefore their population is very limited in terms of its biological variability. So it's a question of developing a population, a big enough population to cover all the different things that are needed in a civilization. You have so many different specialists in a civilization, and if you've got very few people, they can't cover all the specialisms. So one thing you need to do is breed. And if you think of the history of North and South America, one of the first things that happens is that families get very much larger than they were in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really, really good point. And of course, you can't just like drag people in from elsewhere and like go to the next door settlement, because if you're an extraterrestrial settlement, probably the next door settlement does not exist, right?
Yes. Yes.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay, I have a question here from Polovnik the First, and this will be probably the penultimate question of the evening. I am currently working on a city inspired by Port Royal, the city in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with a reason why a more powerful nation doesn't just invade the city. What protected Port Royal and other similar settlements, if there were any? So why didn't people just swoop in and raise them, for example?
That is a question that I'm not very capable of answering. I will be absolutely honest about this, but one of the things to explore would be simply distance. It's a very long way from the European nations that were involved in that colonization. And trying to organize a big enough fleet that kept all its ships together in the Atlantic crossing and then in potential hurricanes and so forth may have been a real problem. Added to which, there are things like scurvy. Until they worked out that you need vitamin C, or else that you need to eat all the maggots in the ship's biscuit, which is a source of vitamin C. Yes, wiggly. You lose a lot of your crew on the way, and therefore, if you don't have enough crew to man the guns, there's not much point in trying to attack somewhere like Port Royal. I'm not saying this is the answer, but this is an area that you might want to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say that Port Royal, I think, and I can be wrong on this because, again, this is not really my area of expertise.
Nor mine.
But I think they had some power, like naval power with them or close to them. And I would also say that those cities did change hands quite a lot over that period, over the whole 18th century. There was hand changing. And I don't know if Port Royal was one of them, but a lot of those islands were French, and then they were Dutch, and then they were English.
Yes, they did change hands. The other thing you need to bear in mind is that fortifications on land, on the whole, had a better time of it than cannons on ships, because fortifications on land with cannons could use things like hot lead. They could actually heat up cannonballs and so forth and fire them when they were red hot at ships. And needless to say, if one of those landed on a ship, it would set it on fire. Whereas when you're on a wooden ship, the last thing you want is too much messing around with fire, or you may set your own ship on fire.
Yeah, absolutely. And nobody wants to be on a burning boat. Incidentally, it also is important that once you've taken a settlement, you can actually hold it. So there's no point in attacking a settlement, depleting your crew, and then somebody else comes and you're easy pickings. So there is a certain common sense factor to that as well in you know, the how many men are you going to lose, how quickly you're going to be able to suppress everybody who's in the settlement, because like these weren't helpless people, these were people living on the frontier. They could hold their own colours, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely.
Since we're on the subject of seafaring, our final question here from Black Iron Badger. I'm not even kidding. This is the name. I think it's awesome.
Yes.
What predisposes a settlement towards seafaring? And I would ask even more, what predisposes a culture towards seafaring? Because you see sort of seafaring cultures that make settlements, right? Seafaring settlements, like, for example, the Greek mercantile states.
Yes. I'll be honest, I don't really know. You can say that it's, some people would say that it's a heavily indented coastline, for instance. But that's certainly been the explanation for why Greeks over many, many centuries have been sailors. But you've also got an indented coastline in Asia Minor, what's now Turkey, opposite, and the Persian Empire, which controlled that for a while, actually had to employ Greeks in their navy, despite the fact they had an indented coastline. Italy has a pretty indented coastline, but the Romans were never the sailors that the Greeks were. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's something within the culture. You've got many parts of Greece didn't have much in the way of good agricultural land, so people say that made them turn to the sea. But you could say exactly the same thing for many parts of Italy, where they didn't turn to the sea, although the Venetians in a later period, of course, were eminently good sailors.
Yeah. Although, of course, Venice is half underwater, so I would say it's in their blood, or at least in the boots.
Yes, probably in their boots.
And when we're talking about seafaring nations, I feel like it would be a crime not to talk about the Polynesian Triangle and the culture within the Polynesia, and sort of the many varied cultures that all seem related and to a stemmed of the one of the other. And again, use lots and lots and lots of miles of coastline there because you get lots of small islands.
Yes. Well, in that case, the islands were actually settled because people took to the sea. So they had that seafaring culture, and once the seafaring culture had developed, they just moved from one island to another. One of the most fascinating things about this, and it's a sort of Trivial Pursuits kind of bit of information, but Polynesian sailors considered that the world was flat, and yet they were fantastic navigators using the sun and the stars, and they managed to work out, and they also worked out the tides running, or the currents running through the Pacific, and they were actually able to navigate from one island to another very effectively, despite believing that the world was flat.
That is amazing.
That is amazing. It's a sort of trivial disputes, I was going to say, but that's for small settlements.
And that's why we have governing bodies within settlements. Because
Yes.
Trivial Pursuits. No, that is not true. Please don't believe that. Okay. Before Hamish and I completely lose the plot, I think it is time to say thank you so much to all of our audience who has been here today. And thank you so much, Hamish, for all of this incredible information.
It's been fun.
It absolutely has been fun for us as well. So thank you. Guys, again, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much, everybody who put in questions. They were really, really great questions.
I really enjoyed those questions.
Really fantastic stuff. And I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them, but I think poor Hamish deserves a rest and a glass of wine now. I would also, of course, like to thank you amazing guys who have been supporting us. So thank you so much for the follows. Rocker the Third, thank you Banshee Bay 15, thank you Black Iron Badger, thank you Pundit 63, yes, Stule for the follows, for the subscriptions. Thank you so much Emperor Charles II and Aegon TV. Glad to have you in the whole house, Royal Society. And finally, for the bits, the Basic Dragon has been in the house and the gold has been flying. So Basic Dragon, thank you so very much for that. We will be live next week with our new theme of the month. And that theme is exploration. So I will be live with Till from Dungeon Fog and Dimitri in a round table about exploration. What is it? Why do we do it? And what do we hope to gain from it? I've just had 11th hour news. Hefe has already also been throwing bits at us. Hefe, thank you so much. Guys, if you aren't familiar with Hefe, he is a great world builder. He's a World Anvil world builder, and he's been doing some great streams for us recently. So you should check out his Twitch channel. If you are watching on YouTube from the future, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Talking to you from the past. And I think that's everything. So if you would like some more fun, then stay right here. And our very own Baron, Master of Games, is going to be playing RimWorld with our very own Gorge. You'll remember Gorge from last week, who also brought up the Roman settlement right in the north and the amazing party invitation that was found. Do you remember Help the Wall with the...
Vindelander,
thank you so much. It's 9:10 here in the UK, and my brain has told me that it's time to go to bed. So George was talking about Vindelander last week, and this week he's going to be playing RimWorld. So that is a game about building settlements in the frontier. All right, guys, I think that is all from us. So I would like to ask you to grab your hammer and go world build! Or stay and watch RimWorld. That's fun too.